Thank you so much for the kind invitation. And is that on? Okay. And I would say first when Bob asked me to give the talk, I was slightly embarrassed in a way because I've been in Gainesville for 4 years and I really haven't turned over a spadeful of earth in Florida yet, but that's Florida properly speaking. But if you think of Florida as the Spanish construed it as Spanish Florida, then I had dug all over Florida. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, a part of Spanish Florida, now known as Mississippi, that, as we'll see, may or may not have been visited by De Soto, which kind of be the core of my talk today, a site that we're working at. I'm going to come back to this map. And I think, generically speaking, most people are familiar with Hernando de Soto, but just to give you a little bit of background to establish things. The first, if you will, officially Spanish-sanctioned landing in what is now North America was Ponce de Leon in 1513, okay? And the Hernando de Soto expedition was 1539 to 1543. And today, dinner tonight, somebody's asking me about what are the motivations of these people? What led these people to embark on these kind of, almost kind of crazy expeditions in hindsight? And for De Soto himself, he had a very specific aim. He was one of the top lieutenants to Pizarro, who overthrew the Inca Empire in 1532. And all of the lieutenants, as well as Pizarro, became extremely wealthy, but De Soto was not happy with that. And he wanted to replicate what Pizarro had done. He wanted to create his own world in the same way that Pizarro had and Cortez had done by taking over some magnificent empire somewhere else that was under the domain of Native Americans. So that's the reason why he headed north. It was basically the only direction to go. So we now know there were no empires like that, but there were a lot of interesting Native American societies. So he landed, and this is my ephemeral or weak link to Tampa. He landed in what's today Tampa with over 600 individuals, scores of horses. He had a cavalry, and yes, indeed, he did have hundreds of pigs marching along with him as well. So this pretty huge undertaking that began in 1539. This is a generally accepted but not exact map, and I'll come to that point in a little bit, of his paths and travails through the southeastern United States until 1543. He died en route, where you see the red ends and the blue picks up. Moscoso was his top deputy who took over after he died en route. And then who was left managed to stagger down the Mississippi River and back to Mexico. But it's far fewer than 600 people. Louder or too loud?
To the mic.
It's too much?
No.
I think she's asking to hold it closer.
More to my mouth, okay. Like kind of Elvis kind of thing. Okay, so De Soto. Now, the site I'm going to be talking about is a community that was referred to by De Soto's writers as Chicasa. And I'll say as an aside that there are four biographers of the De Soto expedition, varying levels of believability. So they're kind of, if you will, they're kind of the gospels of the De Soto expedition. You take the four of them and you try to overlap them and kind of see where the commonalities were to figure things out. But there does seem to be agreement on the fact that in 1540 he landed in a community that he referred to as Chicasa. Chicasa was a number of settlements. We would call it a chiefdom. You had a chief who was kind of at the capital, which is fairly small, a number of outlying communities. So he moved into Chicasa in 1540. Okay, he had already been in North America for a year. And he stopped in Chicasa to winter there in December because it was very fertile lands. There was a lot of corn. Imagine, at this point he's been on the road for a year. Imagine trying to keep 600 people on the road and horses and pigs. You need a lot of food. Where do you get the food from? You're extracting it from Native Americans. The Native Americans pretty typically are ready to have you go after a while, okay? You've overextended your Airbnb stay. There's nothing left. So if you look at the timeline, he landed in December. He decided to start packing up in March, but by that time the Indians were fed up and they attacked De Soto and his men. And it was a devastating for the De Soto expedition. They lost scores of horses, scores of pigs, a significant portion of the material. They were greatly impoverished, and I'll talk a little bit in a second why this was particularly bad, because it's kind of the second blow that they encountered. So they moved about a mile away, or a couple of miles away, I should say. De Soto tried to re-equip and were attacked again almost 2 weeks later, and at that point they had to leave. Okay, so this is considered one of the more significant points of the De Soto expedition because their fortunes kind of soured after that. And I'll come back to another point later. So this is the timeline. So the site we think we're looking at, and for those of you who are into the DeSoto, mapping DeSoto, I want to emphasize we think we may have found DeSoto or Chicasa, and this is an array of the tools that were found. I'm going to come back to this. But a number of the tools here seem to be fairly typical of 16th century Spanish assemblages, and I'll talk about some of those in more detail in a little bit. But this is kind of coming forward to my conclusion already. This is the stuff we have that makes us think that we're at Chicasa. So let me talk a bit more about the expedition. But what I want to say here is, if you look at this map, you will not see, if you're a historian or archaeologist, perhaps a more controversial map of the southeastern United States. And the reason for that is I can't begin to describe to you the fights and the blows that people have had over where exactly was the DeSoto expedition, okay? So, in fact, if you say you've had a DeSoto site, it's kind of like saying you've come up with cold fusion or you've seen a Martian, because people started, it's like, no, there's just no way, because there have been so few DeSoto sites. In fact, as I'll talk about in a second, there's really only one DeSoto site. This is where Chicasa, we believe, more or less is on this kind of roughly constructed map. Just to give you a sense of the controversy, a good colleague of mine by the name of Dennis Blanton has a site called the Glass Site that he discovered about 10 years ago that he's argued is a DeSoto site because it has artifacts that look like they should be from that era. So these beads you see down at the bottom, these are very standard 16th century beads that he's found from the Glass Site in Georgia. And these iron celts or chopping implements are also very typical of what the Spaniards were trading to Native Americans in the 16th century. No question that he has a site that has at least some artifacts dating to the 1500s or so. The problem is there's a lot of ways these artifacts can land somewhere. So what I've done is I projected in the corner, hopefully you can see that, the putative route of the DeSoto expedition, and then I've shown you where artifacts that people feel pretty confident date to the 1500s have shown up around the southeastern United States. And you notice that they generally track the DeSoto expedition, but if you look at the Glass Site is well east of the accepted route of the DeSoto expedition. So when Dennis started saying 10 years ago they had a DeSoto site and first appeared in the Atlanta paper, I thought was, oh, he's really stepped in it, you know, and he has. There's been a huge fight for about 10 years or not, whether this is a DeSoto site. And one of the difficulties is artifacts don't stay in the same place, particularly things that are viewed as valuable or NIFU average. So Native Americans are also trading these artifacts. So if you look at Florida, for example, there are a number of 16th century artifacts that occur east of the accepted route. They probably got traded over, they gravitated over, who knows how they got over there. So a lot of people who are countering Dennis's arguments are saying that, look, we don't question that you have 16th century artifacts. We question how they got there. Not only do you have the DeSoto expedition coming to the west, but you have the French who are making landings later in the 1500s that were very unsuccessful, but they're leaving a lot of stuff. So the question is it direct contact or is it exchange? And the other question that I want to bring into this is, besides that, what do you want to know when you say you have a DeSoto site? To me, it can really devolve to like George Washington slept here. You're like, okay, well, so what? Then what do you do with that if you're an anthropologist in particular? What are the interesting questions that revolve around answering that kind of question? So one of these is kind of embodied in this graph right here. This, to archaeologists, is kind of the standard normative, stereotypical model of how European artifacts began entering into Native American hands from the 1500s, moving into the 1800s. So the normative model is beginning in the 1500s, you have Spaniards or several expeditions that are moving around. They tend to selectively trade valued items to chiefs, and they're very rare, so these typically show up in burial context, okay, with people who have an elite status, very important chiefs or that kind of thing. And indeed, that kind of does seem to be the pattern, okay? And then you get, in moving into the 1600s with the expansion of the Spanish mission system, then later on the French, and then the English show up. Artifacts start becoming more common. At the early stages, there's European artifacts, I should say, but they're still tend to be controlled by chiefs and carefully distributed, so they're getting wider, they're circulated more widely, but still kind of limited. And then when you move into the 1700s, and you had the fur trade is occurring and the slave trade with Indians, and a lot of Native Americans are getting very wealthy. There's tons of goods that are percolating, European goods that are percolating into Native American sites, such that if you look at a Native American site from the late 1700s or early 1800s in the southeastern United States, it pretty much looks like any other kind of individual living, Euro-American individuals or American, so to speak, individuals. You only almost know it's a Native American site because you've got a map or something that tells you the Cherokees lived here or Chickasaw or whatever. So this is this is a controversy for Dennis. Dennis says he has a site from the bottom here, but his artifacts look like the middle there. Okay, a lot more artifacts, and they're showing up in non-burial context. So this is the difficulty he was facing, and to kind of jump ahead again, this is the difficulty that we're facing at Chicasa. Okay, we're finding more artifacts and in context that don't fit this model right here. But I'm going to argue at the end that shows that there are possibly some other interesting things going on in terms of the European Native American experience that aren't encapsulated by this kind of normative model right here. So once again, just to remind you, this is some of the high points of the tour before we get into archaeology. So I said there's one site that's unambiguous or unargued, so to speak. This is Hernando de Soto's first winter encampment in 1539, which is outside Tallahassee. That's been found. It's been excavated. Everybody agrees that's a De Soto site. It's not De Soto visiting Native Americans, so to speak. He kind of sets up a big camp. But everybody agrees that's a De Soto site. There's not a single other site in the United States that people are unanimous about as a De Soto visitation site. Okay, there's a lot that have been claimed. Very few have kind of answered the call, so to speak. So De Soto lands in Tampa, more or less, somewhere. So somewhere out there is a De Soto site. This is the winter camp. Kofetacheki, there's a site here called the Mulberry Mound. We think probably is a De Soto visitation site, and there's some archaeologists who started working there recently, interestingly, funded by Duke Energy. There's a plug for them. And this is also an interesting chiefdom, so to speak, because there was a female chief, which surprised the Spaniards who weren't used to seeing female leaders. So this was an interesting site. This is Mabila. This is the major site they visited before they hit Chicasa in Mississippi. Mabila is in Alabama, and the Spaniards encountered an even more unfortunate battle where they were attacked by hundreds of Native Americans, lost a huge amount of material, and this is when they packed up, started moving again, moved to Chicasa. Same thing happened to them later in the year at the end of 1540, so they had this 1-2 blow. It literally took, I can't give, they didn't give me percentages, but they had to have lost 50 to 60 to 70% of the material. I'm talking about weapons, stuff for the harnesses for the horses, everything you'd think of had been burnt, lost, and so on, because they had to. In fact, if you look at his northward route here, De Soto did something that's kind of clever, and it makes you think about the way people pondered logistics in those times, which is hard to fathom. But he had a fleet of ships, the ones at Tampa. Their orders were to keep scouring back and forth along the coast for a year or more, just in case they had to bail, in case they were going to head south to the Gulf. They generically kind of knew where they were as they were moving around southeastern United States. Not exactly, but generically. So morale was so bad after Mabila and Chicasa, the disasters there. De Soto was getting some feedback, like it's time to head south to hit the Gulf, it's time to board the boats, we want to go back to Cuba. So that's why he takes the whole route northward there. It's like he went in the opposite direction because he was afraid his whole expedition was about to fall apart because of these two military disasters. Again, why is Chicasa and Mabila considered really pivotal points? And then again, there's Chicasa on the map. Okay, so interestingly enough, in Mississippi, there's not a whole lot of controversy about where Chicasa might be. Getting lazy, sorry. Where Chicasa might be, because the accounts, the 4 accounts, are so very, very detailed about their passage from Mabila. We know that if you know where Columbus, Mississippi is today, where the Tombigbee River is, there's a great place to ford the river there. From the descriptions, we think somewhere in that, he crossed with his men somewhere in that ballpark. And then he talks about crossing the floodplain in a day, moving up into a hilly region and finding Chicasa. So we feel Chicasa is due west of this locality you see here. But having said we kind of know where it is, even with this information, we knew where Chicasa was within like 20 by 20 miles, which of course is like finding a needle in a haystack. So generically we agreed where it was, but we're not 100% for sure. But this is the town of Starkville today, where Mississippi State University is. Okay, and this is Starkville. This is a series of sites that are known as the Starkville complex, surprisingly, because the town of Starkville is here. But these are interesting because these are a lot of small sites that are known to date to the proto-historic period, which to archaeologists would be 1400s, 1500s or so. So the belief has been, given all these sites that date to the 1500s, maybe Chicasa is in this welter of sites somewhere. And that idea has been perpetuated by the fact that there are burials that have showed up that had metal artifacts that look like they're Spanish, which kind of fit that model that I showed to you earlier for early contact and where artifacts are likely to show up. So this is a model. 22OK778 is the site number for the site we're working at that we think is around Chicasa, also known as Stark Farms. And this is just another perspective on Stark Farms, where its location is today. Like I said, near the Tombigbee River, in an area known as the Black Prairie, incredibly fertile soils. And in fact, it really was an eastern extension of the prairie. There are accounts of bison here, for example, well into the 1700s, elk and so on. Very fascinating physiographic region. Okay, so this is us. This is us metal detecting at Stark Farms. And this is my first major introduction to metal detecting about 5 years ago. And I have to tell you, it's kind of like occupational therapy. It's a lot of fun. You're just kind of out there, the entire world's zoned out, and you're really feeling zen at the end of the day of metal detecting, particularly if you find something good. So a lot of our work has involved metal detecting. And a lot of people ask me, who aren't archaeologists, how do you find an archaeological site? How do you know where a site is? Well, the long answer is there's a lot of ways, but the short answer is for here is that there was a tract of land on the northwest portion of Starkville that the university wanted to buy, Mississippi State University, to turn into a research development area, okay? In order to do that, they first had to do an archaeological survey. So they hired a private firm, and the firm came in and they dug shovel tests. That's what these dots are. These dots are what we call shovel tests, and they were excavated at 30-meter intervals. And a shovel test is, it's not like the units you see on National Geographic, these nice perfect squares. They're really quick and dirty holes that are about this big and that deep, where you're just trying to find artifacts to identify that you have a site, okay? And then if you find a site, then you'll kind of close up your intervals, maybe to 10 intervals or something along those lines. So what you see here is, I don't know if you can see the light, but the empty circles are where artifacts have not been found. Those are negatives. And the filled-in circles are where artifacts have been found. So they found a lot of artifacts, and they were typical of the Starkville complex. That is, pottery that looked like it dated to the 1400s or so, but no metal artifacts whatsoever. It looked like a typical site that was occupied in the 1300s, 1400s by Native Americans before Spaniards or whoever showed up. And this is kind of the core where they found the largest concentration of material. So this was considered the core of the protohistoric site of Stark Farm. So that's where things stood in early 2015, okay? It so happens at the same time this firm had finished this site, we had begun a collaborative project with the Chickasaw Nation, who are now in Oklahoma, but whose homeland is northern Mississippi. And what the Chickasaw Nation wanted to know was this. They knew that a lot of their communities in the 1700s and into the early 1800s, before removal and before they were forced to move in the 1830s, were around the modern city of Tupelo. Speaking of Elvis, that's his birthplace. But we had a sense that these were the dates of the sites and where they were located preceding the Chickasaw ancestors, but we only had a very poor grasp of that. So they asked us to enter into, when I say us, I mean University of Florida, Ole Miss, University of South Carolina, to enter into a collaborative project to try to find ancestral sites earlier in time to look at this trail moving northward, because there was a migration from the 1400s into the 1700s or so. And they kind of had an interesting twist to it. They said, we want you to do this, and the other part of the project is we want you to train Native American college kids in the methods of archaeology. So it was such a wonderful opportunity. How could we say no? It was a really fantastic project. So part of our team involves Native American college students. So at the time we were starting this project, we had heard about this work going on at Stark Farms, and I'm like, what the heck? And I have to admit, I like to say there was a something scientific going on, that I had this great research hypothesis, but we're like, hey, there's an interesting site that just got discovered. Let's grab our metal detectors and go check it out. It was kind of one of those highly detailed, well-planned projects. And this is Stark Farms. Where I showed you the shovel test, these are all the points where we hit with the metal detectors 16th and 17th century metal artifacts, okay? Let me say as an aside that, this makes it look like it was great, but we found a lot of junk also. There's like farm parts, and there's modern nails, and there's staples and stuff like that. But amongst all that, we found kind of a sea, interestingly enough, of metal artifacts, even though the site had been systematically shovel tested. And this is not to criticize that firm, because, again, these are small holes, and the odds of finding these artifacts actually are pretty small. We actually did some math afterwards, and we figured out to find one of these artifacts, excavating the site, you had excavated 400 square meters per artifact, okay? So it looks like a lot of artifacts, but an archaeologist, they're actually rare in a certain way, but they are a lot of artifacts in the sense that this site has more 16th century artifacts than most sites in southeastern United States. So it was a big find from that direction. And again, just to give you kind of a gestalt or a quick overview, and I'll start talking about some of the individual artifacts that we found. Again, these are all metal detected. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and this is the bad luck of, 30 meters that's a long way. Trust me, it's a long interval between shovel tests. And you can miss a lot, as these poor souls did, who are doing the CRM work. By the way, it's a terrific firm. I won't give their name here, but they're a terrific firm. They missed these huge daw pits. A daw pit is a huge pit that's excavated by Native Americans to get clay to pack the outside of your house as you're constructing a house. So these pits, to give you a sense of scale here, these are about 10 to 15 feet across, and they're like 2 to 3 feet deep, okay? So we found a welter of daw pits that just by bad luck, their shovel test interval had misses also, or this would have made the site look a lot more significant than they had anticipated that it was. This is another perspective of the daw pits. And again, if you haven't done archaeology, let me see if I get this here. This area right here is the natural kind of clay that lies under the plow zone. Everything above this is about a foot or so of soil that's been plowed for about 100 years. And this is the natural clay you'd find underneath. And these are just these huge overlapping pits that are full of organic soil and seeds and bones and ceramics and all kinds of cool stuff. Things like this. So pottery there you see on the left, some nice projector points at the bottom. So this is kind of high graded, showing you some of the cool stuff. And interestingly enough, the only metal artifact we found out of these massive pits that have yielded tons of dirt full of artifacts, we have found only one metal artifact. This little bead, we think it's a bead. We first thought it was a glass bead, and then one of our colleagues who specializes in beads looked at it and said, I don't think it is. And he had a machine called a PXRF that can identify the composition of things. And he said, this is metal. This is an iron bead. And we can't find any accounts of any iron beads anywhere in any accounts of Spanish material. So this is a mystery artifact. So if anybody knows anything about this, has seen anything like this, this is a pretty good call out right here. But to continue the other half of the story, what should a De Soto site look like during this time period? What this means is all of the artifacts that we found, metal detecting, the metal ones, came from the top foot of the soil, and we're pretty sure they came from some sort of domestic context, okay? They didn't come from burials because we haven't found a single burial on the site. If there are burials on the site, we don't know where they are. So these are artifacts that probably have been plowed out of domestic structures, that kind of thing, through the years. So there's an analogy to the site that my friend Dennis has worked on, that a lot of artifacts showing up in non-burial context is seen to date to the 1500s. Okay, another anomaly to the De Soto and Spanish visitation model. We just found this somewhere. This is so cool. I had to show it, even though it's not really related to the metal. We found this is the inside of a domestic structure, and to give you a sense of some of the features on it, this is a post that was excavated. This is that sterile subsoil that I mentioned to you earlier. And things like this, these dark stains, are where posts were at one time. They've kind of rotted in place and left these dark stains. So this is how archaeologists delineate houses, for example. But this is the inside of the house. These are interior support posts, we think, for a roof. We know it's the interior, the deep interior of a house, because this is a hearth. This is a hearth that's shaped like a cross. We have never seen anything like this before. We're counseling with all our artifact buddies, and nobody can find any. There may be some out there. There are accounts in the 1700s, for example, where Native Americans would purposely build fires out of logs in a cross shape, and this is to orient towards the four sacred corners of the earth, but never a burnt hearth like this. By hearth, I mean it's a prepared clay area that was used for cooking and happens to be in the shape of a cross. So these are some of the artifacts that start drilling down into some of the metal things that we're finding of interest. And again, we're finding tons of other stuff that's Native American. And right now our count of metal objects that we feel somewhat confident date to the 1500s and 1600s is around 75 to 80. So these are barrel band fragments. Barrel band fragments, as implied by the name, are metal bands that went about barrels. But looking at the literature on contact period sites, it seems like the Spaniards purposely were taking barrel bands without barrels and breaking them down into fragments as trade items because they knew the Native Americans were working these into tools. There's a high demand for these kinds of things. So these are barrel band fragments that have been worked into some sort of scraping implements. They have very sharp edges that have been worked down. These are Biscayne axes. This is a metal axe. They may have been made in France, but they're very common in the 1500s and the 1600s. And this is another example of recycling. I'm guessing they probably used them as axes because they certainly had tools that were similar to axes. But through the course of time, maybe they're breaking, and then the Native Americans are then reworking the edges and curating and recycling these things as long as they can, because these are very, very valuable items, presumably. Here's some more Biscayne axes that have, the one on the left in particular has broken in half, probably accidentally, and has been reworked into some sort of other cutting tool. These are horseshoe fragments, okay? And these have also been worked into tools, interestingly enough. So, whoops, I'm sorry. This is a bend break. We have evidence where they had a larger horseshoe, and they bent it back and forth as you would with any piece of metal to break it. If you don't have some sort of drilling implement or a saw, you bend it back and forth so that you have two fragments. We have one here that is ground on one side. We would call it unifacially ground to get a nice sharp cutting edge. We have another one here that's bifacially ground as if it were a stone tool. So you grind on two sides to get a very sharp cutting edge. I mean, in a way, it seems kind of obvious. If you don't have horses, well, what are you going to do with fragmentary horseshoes? You're going to turn them into something else. Unless you want to try to shoe a deer or something. This is something we don't know what it is. We call it unidentified cylindrical stock. By stock, we mean a chunk of metal that the Spaniards are probably carrying. That usually expect to see evidence of forging and hammering on the surface, but this has been very carefully ground down. And again, we think this is something that the Native Americans did because it was very common for them to create so-called ground stone tools out of very hard stones. They seem to have applied that methodology to European metals. This is a hand-forged nail or spike to the right. This tool is kind of interesting because we think it's a horse's harness ring, but it's been very quickly and crudely forged and kind of made on the spot, it looks like, and certainly the Native Americans did not do that. But De Soto was carrying portable forges with him, and one of the accounts he talks about when he's first attacked at Chicasa, and then he moves about a mile away, the first thing they do is they set up their forges and they're trying to rearm themselves. They still have a lot of metal, but you're trying to turn a lot of that into weapons as much as they can, and harness gear and that kind of thing. So we think this is probably something that was created by the Spaniards while they were in the Southeast, perhaps after the debacle at Chicasa that ended up in Native American hands. A lot of copper alloy ornaments. These are things that would have been worn. So these are ornaments that presumably where Native Americans got their hand on copper alloy in some form, broke it down into smaller pieces, perforated it, and then used it as some sort of clothing ornaments. We're not sure what the original form of the copper would have been, what sort of object, in other words. There is evidence of copper kettles, for example, being carried by the Spaniards. It could have been that these originally came from copper kettles. Sometimes the Spaniards would just carry sheep brass for trading because they knew Native Americans desired that. So there's no question that these are Spanish in origin. What the original source is in terms of a larger object, we're not sure. These are tinklers and tube beads. You know, the people who first questioned us as to whether this was real or not pointed out, like, you don't see, let's back. We're pointing out that you don't see things like this early on. This is more like the 1600s, but unfortunately there's some people working in North Carolina on a site known as Jawara that dates to the 1560s, where they have a lot of these things. So it's now acceptable to believe that these are potentially artifacts that date from the 1500s. We call them tinklers because presumably, we believe, and this is from looking at the way they were used, say, 200 years later, again, these are things that would be hung from the clothes, and they make noise as you walked around. They would tinkle. And the ones at the bottom are, these are probably rolled brass beads. Again, recycled from Spanish materials. This is one of the stranger artifacts we found, or more unusual or cool artifacts. If you think of a ramrod attached to a musket, this is the metal tip to that. It even had wood intact inside of it. Okay, so it either belonged to a musket or an arquebus, some sort of early firearm. I find this in DeBragg. I found this one. This is a small metal. This is a small cannon shot. Now we're in Mississippi, and when you think cannon shot, you think Civil War, of course. I can say this. So this here we're using inductive and wishful thinking, but I can tell you that our research has shown us that there were literally no Civil War engagements in this locality. There were no camps. There were no skirmishes that we're aware of, and we do know that De Soto carried a small cannon with him throughout most of the southeastern United States. So he did have a cannon. So this is a maybe De Soto cannon shot. Getting close to the end here. This is the last artifact, and this is kind of an amazing one that we just discovered going back to our artifacts last year. This is another one of those ornamental copper alloy pieces. It's probably about this big. And one of my colleagues looking at it again, as we're preparing for photographs and stuff, he kind of looked over and he's like, holy cow. I'll tell you as a prelude that the salts in copper are great for preservation. So this is some sort of textile that's been preserved inside the symbol. And we're trying to get it to a textile specialist to tell us what it was. I like to think it's part of De Soto's tunic or something like that. But you know, the reality of the matter is De Soto would not have been wearing something like this. If it is anything, it was probably had become a portion of Native American clothing, but still a pretty fascinating artifact. And so all I want to say here as I'm closing down here is that we too have a site that has a lot of artifacts that show up in domestic contexts that cover a lot of variability that don't fit into the model, the normative model that I described earlier. But I think what it shows is that the normative model really hasn't covered all the circumstances. The normative model has really been predicated on the idea that the Spaniards were controlling these artifacts before they could give them to Native Americans. But there were certainly a lot of events and circumstances that were outside of the control of the Spaniards and other Europeans where they would lose control of these artifacts, and they would enter into a much wider circulation among Native Americans. And the disasters at Mabila and the disaster at Chicasa, we argue, are instances of that, and that's why we believe we may have Chicasa, a little more on that to close out, and why these artifacts, in fact, are not so unusual and don't go against the grain necessarily. So just to close, these are our competing hypotheses. And I'll say this inside, an archaeologist, I just want to know, did you take radiocarbon dates? Yes, we have, and they're frustrating because they span 1400s to the 1600s, which really doesn't tell us anything in terms of Spanish expeditions. You know, it just says, well, we're in the right ballpark, but we kind of knew that already. So are we at Chicasa? We're not sure. Here's the problem with the Chicasa model. If you look at the accounts that the Spanish described about Chicasa, it was a conflagration, okay? Scores of houses were burned, many horses were burned, hundreds of pigs were burned. We're not finding evidence of burning. We're thinking we should find pits that have scorched horse bone in them, scorched pig bone, and the Native Americans are going to, you know, this is meat. They're going to eat it if they get the chance. We think we should find more evidence of the disaster than we have found so far, and we haven't, quite frankly. The only potential saving grace is that we haven't explored all of the sites. So it could be that there's another portion of Chicasa, and we're going back in a couple of months, that we just haven't lit upon yet. But given that lack of evidence, even we have to say you can't say we're at Chicasa yet. An alternative is trade goods. We don't think this because they all seem to be in the same time frame. They all seem to be the same types of stuff, whatever. That there's a homogeneity in a way that makes it seem like it's more episodic than kind of a stream of trade goods coming to a site, as you might expect. We're kind of the idea we're playing around with now that we think may be acceptable to the De Soto doubters is maybe this is mining behavior. We think that what if this site is not Chicasa, but Chicasa is very nearby? And we try to imagine what would happen if you had a disaster like Chicasa. You would have Spanish metal literally lying all over the place. Okay, this incredible new substance being encountered by these Native Americans with a lot of potential value. And you know, nobody's there. There's no chief controlling it because everybody's evacuated. It's kind of the turmoil and the fog of war and that kind of thing. We believe that Chicasa could be the next hill or 2 hills over, and that for a period of time after the disaster of 1540, Native Americans in the larger area may have been mining the site for metal and keeping it. And a way that we could test this is we need to go to other sites in this locality. The best way to prove this is to see, are there 8 sites in this locality? They're showing a lot of stuff, and I would argue then if we do, we don't have Chicasa, but we still have a pretty cool manifestation of the aftermath of the Battle of Chicasa. And finally, I want to thank my crew of, here's the Native American college students wondering what they're doing sweating out in Mississippi with a bunch of crazy archaeologists, and the rest of the gang. So thank you very much for the invitation. So questions?
So were De Soto and his men, they were, when they came to Chicasa, were they living in the houses of the Native people that was their village, or did they build their own structures, or like what?
Yeah, they, you know, sometimes they're kind of vague about things I think are potentially embarrassing about what, you know, sometimes they're very blunt about what they did, and other times you can tell they're kind of hedging. So they said they occupied empty houses. So then the question is, how often do you run across a village of empty houses? So the implication is that the chief gave up these houses, or was asked to, or forced to. But that's the other weird thing is the village, the houses they occupied were described as being only 20 or 25. So you can't hold 500 or 600 people, and so there's a lot of people camping out or whatever. And one suspects the officers who are staying in the houses and the NCOs who are camping out in the woods.
Yeah.
Your earliest route map looked like a drunk man walking. Did he have a target? Did he go from here to
You know,
there?
that's such a great question. His question was the route map would look like a drunk walking across, and there is a method behind that madness, but it wasn't his method, and that is, first of all, there are a lot of significant trails in the southeast United States, so at times he was trying to follow that. But you know, he was going from major village to major village when he could, and quite frankly, oftentimes he was kidnapping people.
Right.
And he was saying, I want to know where the next lucrative village is. And you start seeing this pattern, and it's like, and what is he doing? Is there anything gold? Is there anything that looks like this? Which of course looks like copper. But you get you know, some of the accounts as he's moving to the interior, and word is moving ahead. You know, there's some strange people coming this way. So word is flaring into the southeast. So the belief is that Native Americans are saying, oh, we don't have any of that stuff.
We don't.
But the next people do,
Yeah,
so
those
keep
guys.
moving, keep
Right.
moving, keep moving. So one of the ideas is he's being purposely just led out of chiefdoms into other people's chiefdoms. A lot of these chiefdoms are fighting with one another too. You know, so one of the things you want to do is get De Soto out of your chiefdom into your enemy's chiefdom, and maybe he'll create some havoc there.
With all the battles, did you find any human bones?
Have not found human bones. Yeah, so, you know, and that's a good question because the Spaniards are not carrying bodies with them. So somewhere they're presumably receiving Christian burials. You would expect individuals lined up in a row. But at the same time, these burials are going to have to take place outside of the site of Native Americans who are probably going to rifle the burials. You know, even to find Chicasa, the odds of finding European burials are not good. But we haven't found Native American burials either.
I Just last year, I learned about all the problem with wild boars in
Right.
Georgia and the Carolinas. Was that
Yeah.
true in Mississippi too? Or?
Yes, there are boars everywhere. So who knows if they go back to DeSoto or not? Because there's just a pattern of bringing pigs and more pigs. But yeah, they're everywhere. But from the accounts I've seen, Native Americans like them. And you may know this already, but the term barbecue comes from the Spanish word barbacoa, which they picked up from a Native American term, which kind of this stilt that sits over a fire where you would hang meat. So.
Oh, the tidbit.
David Duncan's 1996 work on DeSoto expedition mentions Jay Johnson borrowing NASA equipment in the search for Chicasa. And that's 23 years ago.
Borrowing NASA equipment.
Yeah, I think imaging, they mentioned infrared.
Wow. Huh.
Mentioned infrared, in fact.
I know Jay Johnson, but I've never heard him mention it, so now I'm going to ask him that when I see him. I know that Jay he's a kind of remote sensing expert, so he uses ground penetrating radar and that kind of thing. But I've never heard him using, but I can say this as a side, it's interesting. NASA has something called a space archaeology program, where every couple of years they offer funds to archaeologists to use their equipment to try to find sites. So it's definitely believable. It's kind of a fascinating program.
He was doing it in 96.
Huh.
Some of the books that I've read indicate that Narvaez camped in that same general area near Tallahassee. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, that's the problem with what I've skimmed over. The difficulties that Dennis Blanton is finding with the glass site is you have Narvaez was there, De Luna was there in the 1560s, and Narvaez preceded DeSoto. So there were a lot of Spaniards landing in this area. There's a lot of opportunities for artifacts to move across the landscape. But I was still think it begs the questions for what Dennis has at the glass site. Why do you get a site that has a lot of Spanish artifacts on it? So I think the glass site, there's something potentially special about it, but we don't know what. And I would say also that the French have a couple of 1500s settlements also that turned out to be disastrous. So presumably there's a lot of material from there moving to the southeast. So I think, again, given that normative model that I showed you, there's a lot of funnels of goods moving into the southeast. The other thing I should point out is that I pointed out that Ponce de Leon was the first sanctioned Spanish expedition, but certainly in 1513, but certainly the Spaniards knew there was something up here, but they were trying to control that governmentally in terms of who could go and lay claim to it. But we know from other accounts that there were slave traders who were going up and down the coast who were taking Native Americans and selling them elsewhere in the Caribbean well before Hernando de Soto got there. So there's yet another source of potential goods going in over which we really don't have any kind of historical control.
Everything that everything I've read about DeSoto, pretty much I'm left with the impression that he had no intention of befriending the Indians whatsoever. He either killed them or took them as a kidnapping. Right. And so if he every village, every compound that he went to, if he kidnapped people from that compound, wouldn't that account for some of these artifacts being found in places where you as archaeologists don't think they should have been?
I would agree with that. Yes, definitely. Yep. He took everybody that he needed. He took women as concubines.
Yeah.
He took people as translators.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities for that.
The Stark Farm site is close to the Tom Bigby River, the historical.
I would say it's about 25 miles west of it.
Oh, okay. It's not in a floodplain.
No, it's not. It's a weird topographic region that I mentioned slightly earlier. It's called the Blackland Prairie. It's like a ridge or prairie that moves into Mississippi and Alabama.
One more question.
Sure.
Is there any overlap in your work searching for Chicasa and the work searching for Mobilla, two battle sites that are relatively close by?
His question was, is there any relationship between our search for Chicasa and the so far unsuccessful search for Mobilla that some folks in Alabama and elsewhere have been carried out? They're related in the sense that we all know one another. We have a beer together, meetings, and that kind of thing. But they have been searching pretty systematically for a while and have frustratingly had no luck whatsoever. Now, I think the difference is they're trying too hard. They've been trying to find it, whereas we just lucked into Chicasa. They're working at it far too hard. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.